Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Harvest Community Church podcast. I am Chris Quinn, an associate pastor on staff, joined once again by Matt Garino, our lead pastor. Welcome, Matt.
Still on staff.
Still on staff.
I think.
We'll check after this episode.
We'll see if my name is still on the door when I leave, as soon as we're done recording.
Exactly. Or I could just delete it and pretend like this episode never happened.
The way we're starting may be a good idea. Let's just keep going.
Exactly. All right. Well, we've been answering some questions regarding the book of Isaiah, and we've been viewing passages through the lens of how the Bible fits together, where the covenants in the Old Testament kind of progressively reveal and then point to God's redemption plan through Jesus. And so one of the most frequent categories of questions that we received through the Isaiah series was about passages that connected to the end times, the book of Revelation, the millennium, the return of Jesus, etc., all these different things, which we call, as I said, the end times. So, Matt, what are the end times? Just so we make sure, in case somebody has never heard that term before, we can at least explain it so that people would understand what that means.
Right. My real in-depth, thoughtful answer to that. You ready?
I'm ready.
You got a pen to write down this definition?
I have tons of pens, but I don't know where they are.
The end times are the times at the end.
Wow.
But
it's deepest moment on the podcast ever.
But seriously, I mean, that really is kind of what it's about. We talk about the end times. It's the Bible's description of what God prophetically promises to do to bring human history to a close, and the final judgment of Satan and sin and death and evil, and the ushering in of eternity with him in heaven. And the Bible has a fair bit to say about that. So when we're talking about what the Bible has to say about that, we usually just refer to it as, the end times.
Right. Yeah. So then how does our discussion of the Bible's overarching story through all of these covenants kind of inform our discussion about the end times?
Good question. And I think the first answer is probably a lot of times it doesn't. And
interesting.
It should, or it doesn't enough.
Right.
What the Bible says about the end times is, I think, best understood as the last chapter, as it were, of a longer, full, complete story, message that God's been telling us ever since the beginning of the Bible. And because his teachings about the end times represent, the final closing of that story, you can't really understand the story apart from understanding how it ends. So talking about the end times is important, but you also can't really understand the end times without understanding the whole story that precedes it.
Right.
So what story is being concluded here? And until you really understand that story, it won't really give you much context for the end times. But unfortunately, I think a lot of times American Christians have been led to think of and consider the Bible's teachings on the end times as a separate category of theology, of Bible study. We tend to think of it as isolated. Like that's where you go study like some of the weird prophecies in Daniel and some of the things Jesus said in Matthew 24. And then of course, that's when you finally crack the book of Revelation. The whole thing is weird. And that's sort of a specialized subset of theological ideas that you drill into on its own. And there's really good reasons to study all those things on their own because there's a lot there to learn. But it's just important, I think, to recognize that none of that is actually isolated in the Bible from the rest of the Bible. It's all intermingled and it's all interconnected. So it's one story, and we should understand that story as we're thinking about the end times.
Yeah. So then how does the end kind of fulfill God's plan from the very beginning? Like, how do we see that kind of play out?
Maybe the best way to do that would be the analogy of a chain. That's a pretty useful analogy that I think works here. I think like the paper chains I used to make with my kids when they were young. When our kids were little, we'd go down to, we lived here in Oregon, and all the in-laws, or the grandparents, lived in California. And so like every year for Christmas, it was a big deal with the kids. We'd, get in the car or on a plane, or we'd go down to California for Christmas. And so it was always a big visit. So we'd create the big countdown chains, right? 30 days ahead of time, you got 30 links, and every day you get to take off a link, and we'd hang it up in the dining room or whatever. And that's kind of a picture of the Bible story. It's like, it's a chain, and there's all of these prophecies, there's all of these covenants, there's all of this Bible teaching, there's all of this history in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, but it's all linked and it's all starting somewhere and it's all going somewhere.
Hmm.
And so in order to understand like the ending link or the ending couple of links, if we want to talk about, the Bible's teachings on the end times, we should just always keep in mind these previous links and make sure that they're, connected in that way.
Hmm. Yeah. I think that's a really beautiful way to think of it. This chain link, that it's not these, like even you're saying, this isolated issue of these are the end times. Go find those particular end times passages that speak about those things. No, it's an overarching story that is flowing from beginning to end. And it's important to understand how that all flows into it.
Yeah, and you can actually see that chain because, like even you just said, if you told somebody, go find all the end times passages, the interesting thing is you very quickly realize you're not just turning to the end of the Bible.
Right.
You're going to find end times passages in Genesis.
Right.
Which is actually at the beginning. You're going to find end times passages in what the Hebrews call the former prophets, and especially the latter prophets. So that's guys like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. And a lot of these questions came out of our study of Isaiah, and in the Gospels and so on and so forth. So the quote unquote end times passages are actually all throughout the Bible, which would be sort of weird if you're just thinking about the Bible chronologically and linearly. But I think that just illustrates the linkages. So just take the book of Revelation. It is deeply rooted in Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel and a lot of these Old Testament prophets. And that's just one example of how like you can't read the book of Revelation without ending up in the Old Testament. I mean, you can, but you'll misunderstand it.
Right.
It is pulling so many of the prophetic messages from the Old Testament and then adding new information to them in light of Christ. And then we get these final, visions that God gave to John and he wrote down in Revelation. So you just see those links all the time. Revelation isn't just this thing that's out there. It's constantly linking back to what came before, and it's finishing a story that God has been telling for centuries. And so we should just follow those links where they present themselves.
Yeah, because oftentimes I think what you're kind of touching on here is the idea of the end times. Yeah, we got to understand the book of Revelation, but we need to understand the whole Bible, right? And that oftentimes what happens with the particular books that people are studying is it's such a foreign concept in terms of the genre and the type of literature that it is, that people don't understand, like, what am I really reading? So I think in order to answer, we'll get to book of Isaiah in a minute, but kind of talk a little bit about like the structure of the book of Revelation so that we kind of understand what it is that we're looking at when we study that book in particular to try and understand the end times.
Yeah, probably helpful for where we're about to go next with the question that came out of Isaiah. So briefly, Revelation is read two different ways by Christians. One is to read it chronologically and linear.
Yeah.
And so that's where you just assume that, and we're pretty much talking about Revelation chapter 4 on to the end. So all of the apocalyptic visions that God gave the Apostle John, and he wrote them down, that you understand those visions are sequential. Just one comes after the next, comes after the next, comes after the next, and it just goes from start to finish because that's how we Westerners think. That's what makes sense to us. And so it's very easy to pick up the book of Revelation and read that. The events of chapter 11 must come after the events of chapter 10. Like it's just describing history in a chronological linear sequence from start to finish. And if you read it that way, then you assume that pretty much everything in the book is yet future from our perspective, that the entire book pretty much is describing events that have not yet taken place, but will at some point in the future. The other way that Revelation is understood by Christians is that it is maybe rather than a line, it's more like a spiral. Like if you think of a big spring, like a car spring or something, where it says some things and then it goes deeper, but it circles back around and covers those same events from a different perspective. And then it circles back around and covers the same events again from a different perspective. And so every few chapters in Revelation are kind of a self-contained unit, and that the book of Revelation is made up of, 6 or 7 of these kind of helical spiral sorts of things, where it's going back over the same periods of history and the same events with different information and from a different angle each time.
Right.
If you read it that way, then the events being described in the book of Revelation are often not understood to be all in our future. Some of them are clearly in our future because they talk about the final judgment and the new heavens and the new earth. But a lot of the events of the book of Revelation are just describing human history as it has been in the church age, ever since Jesus went to heaven after his resurrection, and in between the time that he will come back again. That's kind of what we call the church age. And so many people understand Revelation to be talking about life in the church age and at the end of time. So those are the two major different ways that Revelation is understood.
Yeah, and how you see that structure will determine how you answer some of these questions that we've received about end times type theology. And so do you have a particular way that you would lean towards?
Right. Let's put our cards on the table. Yes.
Absolutely.
I read the book of Revelation the second way. That it's a spiral sort of thing. It's the fancy word for that is recapitulation, that later chapters are just going back to and recapitulating what was said in earlier chapters, adding new information, coming at it from a different angle. To go into all the reasons why is probably more than we have time for in this podcast, but I'll just say that I think when you look at the way the text of Revelation presents itself to us, I think that's the way it's put together. You know, if you kind of ignore chapter and verse markings, which were added later anyway, and you just look at the section markers that are in the actual text of Revelation, there's really good reason to see it going back over the same things from different points of view. So it seems like it's just native to the text to read it that way, because I think that's how the text itself is put together. And that's obviously what we should take our cues from when we're interpreting the Bible, is like, what is the structure of this text itself? So that's how I read Revelation.
Yeah. And I think I would agree with that based on my own study of doing Revelation, that the chronological view seems to be putting an alien culture onto it in terms of this Western mindset of everything being linear and chronological. This is not a Western book. This is a Middle Eastern Jewish book. So we need to see it in that realm and how they would have understood that. So now let's transition into one of the questions that we had when it came to the end times and the book of Isaiah. In particular, it has to do with the millennium. And there's all kinds of passages. I even found an article the other day, Matt, that had 15 potential references to the millennium in the book of Isaiah.
Yeah, this does not surprise me.
So we're going to go over one for all of you.
So we got some questions from our people, right? Of like, is this passage in Isaiah talking about the millennium, or is it something else? Yeah, great. So great questions.
I just picked one. Good. And this did come from a member. So we're going to look at Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 5. But we'll also look at, as a comparison, Revelation 21 through 6. So to give people a chance to maybe turn there if they're listening, what is the millennium, first of all, Matt? How would you define that?
Yeah, the word millennium just means 1,000 years, right? The time period of 1,000 years. And it's a reference to one of the passages you just mentioned in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 to 6. The Bible there mentions a 1,000-year period of time where Christ will be reigning on the earth together with resurrected saints, and Satan will be bound in some meaningful way. And that sounds like that's the millennium. So there's this, when people talk about the millennium, that's what they mean. They mean the 1,000-year period of Christ reigning on the earth that's described in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 to 6.
Yeah, and that's a particular position. Not everybody believes that is what is being said there, but we'll get to that in a minute. First of all, what we're going to do is we're going to read the passages side by side so you can hear them kind of right next to each other and see the just listen and hear the comparison. So I'm going to go ahead and go and read Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 5. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords and plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Now read us Revelation 21-6.
Yeah, so here's the millennium passage. For the sake of time, I'll just do verses 1 through 4.
Sounds good.
The Bible says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. And I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received the mark on the foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years." So again, you see that 3 times, that reference of this 1,000-year period where Satan is bound, Jesus is reigning.
Yeah. And so how should we kind of look back and see maybe how do we understand Isaiah 2 in its original context, what Isaiah was trying to get at for us?
So what God is promising in Isaiah 2 is that the mountain of the Lord would be lifted up above all other mountains, and all the nations of the earth would come to it. God would reign and rule, and there would be no more violence. This is basically what's in Isaiah 2:1.
Sounds about right.
Well, the mountain of the Lord, immediately triggers something for people who know the Old Testament. It's talking about the Temple Mount, as we call it today. It's a literal hill in the city of Jerusalem that used to have the Jewish temple on it for a long, long time. Now it's got a Muslim mosque on it, but you can still go and see, the Temple Mount today. That is Mount Zion, the mountain of God, all those phrases in the Old Testament. That is where God's temple was under the Old Covenant with Moses. That's the Old Testament. That's where God's presence was. That was the center of Jewish religious life under the terms of the Old Covenant in the Old Testament. So what God is doing there, and of course, by Isaiah's day, the Babylonians were surrounding the city. Isaiah lived through the time when they actually wiped out the city. So he was prophesying some before the city was destroyed and some after. And they totally destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple, and they annihilated everything that was on the Temple Mount. And so through Isaiah, God is promising the Old Covenant people of God, in terms of the Old Covenant, that he is going to restore what has been destroyed. He's going to restore his presence with his people, which was central. Without that temple, they had no means to worship God. It's just very different than how we think about God today. So he promises, I'm not going to abandon you. The promise that I made to you through Moses, that I was going to be your God and you were going to be my people and my presence would be with you in this temple, I'm still going to see that through. You are still going to be as my people in the place of my presence. So in its original context, that's what he was saying. That's how we should understand Isaiah. That's what they would have heard and understood. But I would simply point out that those temple promises that God made even under the Old Covenant did not exist in a vacuum.
Right.
We talked about this a little bit in our last podcast episode when we talked about the temple, where the temple actually goes all the way back to the first chapters of the Bible. We'll get into that more maybe in just a minute here, but we should understand that, the original readers of Isaiah would have understood this to be a restoration of the temple, but there's actually more going on even in the text of Isaiah 2 that connects to the overall story of the Bible, and we'll see that here in just a second.
Yeah, so then how do people see, how are they seeing the concept of the millennium in Isaiah 2?
Right. So Isaiah 2 says nothing about a millennium.
Right.
And as we just heard from Revelation 20, it says nothing about a temple or Mount Zion. But what happens is you can kind of think of the way that it's often understood is that Revelation 20 in the millennium sort of describes a bucket that's mostly empty. In other words, it says there's going to be this 1,000-year period of time, and it does tell us a couple things that are going to happen during that 1,000 years. Some saints are going to be raised from the dead. Satan's going to be bound. Whatever you make of that, that's a whole separate discussion. But in some meaningful way, Satan is bound, saints are raised from the dead, and Jesus is reigning on the earth. And we don't know a whole lot more about it because it's a short passage.
Right.
So it kind of just creates a bucket that's got a couple of rocks in it, but we don't really know what else is in the bucket. And often then people will go back and they will read these promises of restoration of Jewish religious life in prophets like Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
in Isaiah chapter 2, and they will say that must be referring to the same thing because they sure sound similar. And logically, you can make it work. So what happens a lot of times is Revelation 20, in rough terms, is sort of seen as a mostly empty bucket. And passages like Isaiah 2 are seen as the stuff that goes in the bucket. So they're describing what life is going to be like in this millennium. And so Isaiah 2 gets interpreted as, oh, that's the stuff that's going to be happening during the millennium, which we're not told about until much later, but they logically fit together. And so we form theological systems that interpret it that way. And that's how passages in Isaiah are often presented to Christians. It's why I'm not surprised by the questions we got from some of our members, right? We're listening to Isaiah and people say, well, is that the millennium? Because that's often how it's presented. Like, well, this is life in a future millennium.
Right.
Logically, that's possible, but I don't think that's the best way to understand what the Bible's saying there.
Yeah. And oftentimes, like when we get questions from members about this stuff, or even, to be fair, when I first started really realizing this stuff is just the millennium and those kinds of things are just the assumed that is what's going to happen, right? That is what the Bible has said. But there are other ways that faithful Christians, as we talked about in previous episodes, can view these things. And so it's important that we understand that. So then why doesn't that particular perspective work in your view?
Yeah, it works logically. I think you just described it well. If you assume the interpretive scheme, then you can read Isaiah in terms of it, and it sort of works. And that, right. I get why it's persuasive to people. The reason I don't think it's the best view is because I don't think it's the view that the Bible presents to us when you just read the text sort of natively. Nothing in Isaiah indicates anything about a future millennial period. Nothing, interestingly, in Revelation 20 indicates anything about Jewish people or the Promised Land or a restoration or rebuilding of the temple. That kind of stuff. And now that by itself doesn't prove that it's wrong. It's just my way of pointing out that that's one example of how the text itself doesn't lead us to that. I think the reason it's not persuasive to me is, if I can go back to our paper chain analogy, it represents shortcutting the chain. If I had a paper chain that was 30 links long and I grabbed like link number 7 and I just stretched it over and attached it to link number 28, I would have this big loop, in the middle. I would just jump straight from link number 7 to link number 28 and kind of ignore all the other links in the middle. And that's a little bit of what sometimes happens with these end times discussions. And I think that's kind of what's happening there. We go from Isaiah 2 and immediately assume that that's what's happening during the time period of Revelation 20, verses 1 to 6. And we maybe at that point have missed a lot of what came before Isaiah 2, what's in Isaiah 2, what comes after Isaiah 2, and what's happening in Revelation. So, for example, let's go back to Isaiah 2. One of the key features, the first feature of that is it talks about the Temple Mount. It doesn't just talk about a temple. It talks about the Temple Mount. And it says that the Temple Mount is going to be raised above all other mountains. It's going to be the highest of all the hills. Well, right away, we have an interpretive question, right? Like, how literal is that? Is God going to cause a tectonic event? And now the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is going to be thrust up above Mount Everest, which will no longer be the highest mountain in the world. And the Temple Mount's going to be up at like 24,000 feet or something, and you'll need oxygen to breathe up there. I mean, like, most Christians probably don't take it quite that literally. They assume that it's referring to the prominence of the Temple Mount as opposed to the actual height. But God says, I'm going to raise this up above all other mountains in the world. And there's a lot of imagery there with mountains and the worship of gods and so on and so forth. And I only bring that up now to say that there's already some prophetic idiom going on there. In other words, like just the way that prophets talk, there's a little bit of symbolic language, some word picture going on there to describe not just the physical, literal restoration of the literal temple that David had previously built on the hill in Jerusalem, but God is connecting his promise of not just restoring, but expanding the temple and the Temple Mount. So there's this growth, there's this expansion. And by the way, you encounter the same thing in Ezekiel, who is prophesying around Isaiah's time. And Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48 describe a whole new temple complex that's going to be built in the future. And when you actually read the description in Ezekiel 40 to 48, which is really detailed, it's full of these remarkably round numbers. And the temple complex is just massive. It's huge. Like it wouldn't even fit on the Temple Mount. It wouldn't even fit in the ancient city of Jerusalem. The temple itself would be bigger than the whole city and definitely bigger than the Temple Mount. And so again, if that's meant literally, then there's going to have to be some massive geological changing going on. And so you start to realize, like, okay, well, there's even in the Old Testament prophets, there's this idea of significant expansion beyond the temple that had existed literally and physically in the earlier parts of the Israelites' life. So why is that the case? Well, that's where I think these links come in. If we go all the way back to the very beginning of the Bible, this idea of expansion actually makes sense.
Right.
Isaiah and Ezekiel are not coming up with anything brand new. So Genesis 1, God creates man in his image. We talked about this in our covenants podcast. He makes this covenant with man where man and woman are together made in his image. They rule in God's place, and God's command to them is to fill the earth and subdue it.
Right.
So they and their descendants are to rule and reign. And the whole plan before there was even sin is that the rule and reign and blessedness of God that was enjoyed in Eden would be pushed out by the human race on God's behalf and expanded to include the entire earth, that the whole earth would become the dominion of God and his people. That was always our plan. That was the covenant. That was the job that he assigned to us. And then later, when you get to God's promise to Abraham, now we're in Genesis 12, he promises Abraham not only that he will have descendants, which became the Israelites, and that those descendants would be God's people, but he says that through them, I will bless the entire earth. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through my people. So God is saying, like, I've never given up on the command to expand the rule and the reign and the blessedness of God from where it's located with God's people all the way out to all the ends of the earth. That's our job. And so when we see Isaiah and Ezekiel and God's promising through them, hey, I'm going to restore you, but I'm not just going to restore like the Jewish temple worship in Israel as if that was a final destination. It never was. The ancient Israelites were supposed to build a temple, and then they were going to start from Jerusalem, showing the rest of the world what it was like to follow God. And they were too supposed to expand that rule and that reign out to all the nations of the earth, which of course they failed to do. So when God is promising to restore the temple, he's not just going back to the old temple that David built. He's going clear back to Eden and saying this was always the plan. So when you go back, you see those links that cast a lot of light on Isaiah chapter 2. But then, of course, we need to go forward. And there's a lot of links we could stop on, but I'll, for the sake of time, just skip straight to the end and talk about what happens in Revelation. Because the last book of the Bible, Revelation, quotes a lot of Ezekiel and a lot of Isaiah. And it's interesting that those quotes don't appear in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 6, the millennium passage.
Yeah.
But many, many, many of them occur in Revelation 21 and 22. So over and over and over again, which are all about the final state, the new heavens and the new earth, heaven as we know it. And so it seems to me like the Bible is leading us to expect the final fulfillment of the Zion prophecy of Isaiah 2 is going to happen in the new heavens and the new earth. Because that's where you see the city of God, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And just like Ezekiel, it's got all these really large, really round numbers and it's measured. And it's just like it's dominant. It's way bigger than the entire nation of Israel, really. So it's clearly a symbolic reference to the presence of God and the city of God. God is now finally rebuilt. And it is, just like it is in Ezekiel, a perfect square. Perfect cube.
Interesting.
Which goes back to the temple that David built, where the perfect cube was the inner place where God's presence was. It was the only cube, the only square in the whole temple layout. Everything else was rectangular, but the square, the perfect square, was where God's presence was. Well, now the entire New Jerusalem is the perfect square where God's presence is, which really fills the whole earth, which was exactly what he promised he was going to do back in Genesis chapter 1. The rule and the reign of God expanded to the whole earth, and his blessings are known there. And so I think the Bible is leading us to expect the restored Mount Zion really isn't a literal like new Mount Everest in the Middle East. What that means is that God's rule and reign is expanded to the whole earth, and that's what we call heaven.
I love that. So then with that in mind, what is the millennium that is being talked about in Revelation 20 in your view?
Yeah, it's a short passage, and it kind of gets skipped over fairly quickly. So where does it fit, in the scheme? I think if you're reading it as this kind of spiral thing, you realize that Revelation 20 is yet another recapitulation of what happened before it. And it's actually the last recapitulation before the final couple chapters of the book. And so I would read it the way that a lot of Christians read it, that when God is talking about this 1,000 years where Christ is reigning, that 1,000 years is not a literal 1,000, 365,000 days. That the number 1,000, like so many of the very round numbers in books like Revelation, are symbolic, so they're not to be taken literally. By the way, even a lot of people who read Revelation linearly and chronologically understand that the 1,000 years may not actually be 1,000 years. It may be significantly longer or significantly shorter. So that's pretty
exactly.
not everybody agrees, but that's not really a super controversial thing to say. So the number is symbolic, and that's really a symbolic representation, just to cut to the chase, of the church age now. The whole time between Christ's return to heaven and the day of Pentecost and the coming of the Spirit to when he comes again in the future. And the ascension of Christ is way in our rearview mirror. The second coming of Christ is still ahead. It hasn't happened yet. So it's the whole age of the church between now and then. And that's a time period that Revelation goes back to over and over and over again. And I think in Revelation 20, 1-6, it's describing that that same time period as well. That raises a lot of questions of what do you do with the imagery of Revelation 21-6. That's probably a whole separate podcast. But that's how I would understand the millennium.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just describing life right now as we seek to follow God and wait for his return to judge evil and usher in the new heavens and the new earth.
Well, I think if there are other issues that people maybe want to talk to us about when it comes to the end times, we'd certainly love to talk about them. But for the sake of this episode and trying to wrap up pretty quickly, let's ask this question. Why does this matter, seeing the end times in this way, in this kind of chain link analogy? How is this important to us as Christians?
Great question. And I think the best answer is that the whole Bible was given to the whole church for our journey through this life now.
Yeah.
And it was given to the church in order to, and let's just take the book of Revelation in particular. I mean, it was written to first century Christians and Christians in every century since, to help them be faithful to God in the midst of a world where sin and death have finally been conquered because Jesus has died and risen again, but that conquering is not yet fully realized. And so we live in this weird in-between time where Satan is defeated, but he's not yet totally done in. And so the world is full of evil and travail. And I think that's one of the reasons it matters. Revelation in particular, and really the whole Bible in general, helps Christians be sober-minded in our expectations that life in this world following Jesus is going to be hard.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean Jesus didn't win, and that doesn't mean God isn't in control. But it just does mean that life in this world is going to be hard. And so in that way, like the book of Revelation is doing the same thing that the book of 1 Peter is doing. Peter just does it much more straightforward, and Revelation does it with all this crazy symbolic imagery.
Right.
But they're both really trying to help the church be prepared to suffer well and to kind of reject utopian ideals that we can sort of take over the world and transform the world and make it this wonderful, godly place. It's like we're supposed to live faithfully in the midst of a world that often seems like it's going crazy. But that doesn't mean God didn't win. That just means we should expect that it's going to be hard.
Yeah. And I think in many ways also it kind of decreases the anxiety, when it comes to especially understanding the book of Revelation, that oftentimes there's this like idea that you have to decipher this secret code that's inside the book of Revelation. And I know on my personal journey of really studying these things, once it became clear to me that I was like, I really don't think Revelation is this like code book to figure out the end times, and really started kind of thinking about it in terms of what you're talking about. It actually like really decreased my anxiety about what's happening in the world around me. Because then it's just saying, the book of Revelation simply says like, stay sober minded about the fact that there is going to be suffering that we're going to face, but there's great hope in what Jesus is going to bring us in the future. And so our job is to stay faithful and stay focused on the mission that Jesus has given to us to make disciples. And it's like, that's just so simple. And that just decreases all the anxiety about like watching the news and making sure we're seeing all of the different signs and being aware. It's like, nope, Jesus gave the signs. We know what they are of when he will return. And that's it. So our job now is to simply do what he's already told us to do, go and make disciples.
Yeah, and hope is the other side of that coin. So I'm glad you brought it up. It's like being sober-minded that life is hard is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is hope. We do know that God is in control, and we do know that he is going to draw all of sin and death and Satan himself to final judgment, and there is a full restored presence of God on the earth that we can look forward to. And so that's where we put our hope as we seek to live faithfully here and now. We have to live with an eternal perspective as we do the hard things in this life for the greater things yet to come, trusting in God's victory. I think that's what the book of Revelation is trying to tell us. Frankly, I think that's what the whole Bible is trying to tell us.
Yeah.
And that's what we're supposed to live out and take away. And that is hugely relevant. I mean, we all need that every day.
Every day. I know I do. All right. Well, I think that's a great place to close out this episode. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on another episode of the Harvest Community Church podcast. We love you, and we'll see you again on the next episode.